We are just about ready to kick off the first part of today, which is spirituality as a science. Just a little bit of context. When we think about spirituality and where it came from, I think a lot of historians can say that it dates back to really ancient traditions. If you think about South Asia, a lot of mindfulness and Vedic practices there. If you think about Buddhism, a lot of similarities as far as dharma, chakras, yoga, the self, all terms that sound very familiar as far as how we kind of are practicing spirituality today. And at the same time, in preparation for today, I read something by Philip Sheldrake. A lot of you may not know who he is. I didn't know who he was. But he's a theologian that's specialized in religious history and philosophy. And he said that nowadays we can view spirituality as something that is native to everybody, something that is innate to our very being. And that reminded me of something that our first speaker said to me that really stuck, which is people have a really hard time conceptualizing and wrapping their heads around that which you cannot materialize. And I think that is where science comes into play. So our first speaker, Dr. Lisa Miller, she's the founder of the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute at Columbia University. That's the first graduate program and research institution at any Ivy League for psychology and spirituality. Her research has been published countless times. She has a New York Times best-selling book called The Spiritual Child, and if I were to sit here and go on and on about her accolades, I'd be here for 10 minutes. So I highly encourage you to take a look at her website and look at the incredible things she's done. But we're so lucky to have her here in the flesh with us today, so please join me in giving her a warm welcome as she talks to us and shares her knowledge on the intersection of spirituality and science.
Good morning. I am so grateful to be here. This convening, like all moments that is amplified by your presence, occurs in the realm of miracles. We've all come together in a very deep love, a common mission of being part of spirit, truth. The people at your table, the people in our room, we are the experience. And I want to particularly highlight our leaders, our conference organizers, because you really pulled together in this deep, deep, deep vision, all of us here. I can say from Columbia's side that Dr. Wadra, Dr. Kaufman, you have Columbia's best. And then I see the religious leaders, the spiritual teachers, and even as a guest, I know we have outstanding people from whom I can't wait to learn. Because what we are doing is sitting in a circle, teachers, religious leaders, scientists, leaders, and bearing witness from all different perspectives at the true, bright light, the spirit of truth. So the design of today was one of using multiple lenses of human witness onto the single ultimate truth. And I invite you to enjoy looking through the eyes of all of these different teachers and leaders and the eyes of everyone at your table, because we're looking onto one truth. We're here through all decades of life, but we're here in particular honor of the young adults coming of age in this remarkable moment. And so whereas in all parts of our lives there are moments of great blessing and transcendence, moments of trial and breakthrough to spiritual awareness, we are particularly focused on the young adults coming of age today. So I will share with you, if we might, a gift that was given to me by one of my teachers. I always thank my teacher before sharing this gift. It is a gift from the late Dr. Gary Weaver, who helped young adults cross the bridge into their own spiritual journey. So if I might invite you into a 90-second inner practice, it's always an invitation. I'm going to invite you to close your eyes, take 5 breaths, and we'll move through the visualization together, each in our own way. I invite you to set before you a table. This is your table. And to your table, you may invite anyone, living or deceased, who truly has your best interest in mind. Anyone living or deceased who truly has your best interest in mind. And with them all sitting there, ask them if they love you. And now you may invite your higher self, the part of you that's so much more than anything that you have or don't have, anything you've done or not done, your true, eternal higher self. And ask you if you love you. And then finally, you may invite your higher power, whatever word is yours, however you know the source, your highest power, and ask if they love you. And with all of these people sitting here right now, what do they need to tell you now? What do they need to share? What do you need to know? And when you're ready, I'll invite you back. This is your counsel, and they are always there for you. Every tradition in our beautiful global community acknowledges that each and every one of us has a deep seat of transcendent awareness, a deep seat through which we can experience relational spirituality. This is our birthright as much as is 2 eyes, 2 ears, and a nose, as much as is our physical, emotional, and cognitive being. We are innately spiritual beings. And over 20 years, our lab and fellow labs around the world have put together a map of human spiritual development through the lens of science. We've used MRI studies, genotyping studies, long-term clinical course studies, high-risk studies, and in aggregate, we have a mirror onto that which you may have experienced and known your whole life. Because science certainly doesn't prove spirituality. Science doesn't prove the spiritual path. It bears witness. And as we can stand up one by one and give testimony in a sacred house of worship, place of meditation, convening, one by one, speak and give testimony. The chorus of us together is a form of witness, the study sample in science. And so I come to you as someone who shares with you the deep love and the spiritual path and the form of witness that through which we can behold the brilliance of the light in the middle of our circle through the lens of science. Science can also be brought then to some of our greatest challenges that have been silent heretofore on spirituality. Some of you may remember, thinking back a few decades, the Surgeon General has determined that smoking may be dangerous for your health. Well, the Surgeon General currently in office, Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, issued a different advisory. It was on the epidemic of the mental health crisis, the epidemic of the diseases of despair, addiction, depression, and even suicide. The rate of death by suicide now rivals the rate of death by auto accident in high school. A young high school student is far more likely to die by his or her own hand than by cancer or COVID or driving recklessly. This is the crisis of our time. And as I looked through the 36-page report, I hungered to see a reflection of the body of science in top peer-reviewed journals with which I'm going to share today, or which I will share today. So I invite you as families, as parents and grandparents, as leaders, as heads of organizations, because as you know, like a picnic blanket, your understanding fills out through your organization, to join in looking at this roadmap of science so that it might be applied within your own professional band of expertise. So here's the challenge, and here's what the science has to say about it. Can I trouble you for my water? most gracious host. Okay, well, here's the crisis. To date, mental health is logjammed. And when you read most policy reports, and I work with Health and Human Services, and I work extensively with the Pentagon, to date, mental health has been located in the individual. She has depression. He is addicted and at risk for suicide. But if we look at an epidemic in which at the current moment, half of young adults report at least moderate levels of distress, at least some clinical level of depression, it makes more sense to look at the air and water, this tidal wave sweeping through our culture, and ask from whence this came. Well, 40 years ago in this country, in a very good attempt to be inclusive, we threw all talk of religion out of the public square. And with that went the spiritual baby with the bathwater. And with that went the capacity for pluralistic, inclusive, public square discussions of spiritual life. As we try now to grow as a country and be more inclusive around race and gender and orientation, spiritual life is our next step forward. A broad embrace where I want to know you, I want to tell you about Hanukkah, and I want to hear about Christmas or Diwali. I want to learn and know you. I want to talk about the birth of the baby or the crossing of the ancestor in the most fundamental terms. This is what we've lost. And when we lost it, well, 40 years ago is long enough for a young person to grow up, have a baby who's grown up, and is at our door. And again, this is our American challenge back to Surgeon General Vivek Murthy. I work very closely with the Pentagon, who has hundreds of thousands of 18 through 25-year-olds caught in the tidal wave. And I work very closely with our magnificent spiritual mind-body students here who are all going out to address this. And whether we're talking about higher education or entry-level jobs, I work with a large business that says we can't train our young people. We say, hey, here's the goals, go out, come back in a week. I want to see the successes, I want to see the failures. Nothing comes back. Because fragility, the fear of failure. Better to take myself out of the game than to be shot down as a loser. Why is this? Because we've had a disidentification with who we really are as spiritual beings. We've lost the vision that the spiritual core is the hub of the wheel of the whole person. And here's the science that is a roadmap to reinvigorating our birthright. Okay. This will not surprise you. Every single one of us is a spiritual being. Our world is full of beautiful faith traditions. Whether I am Hindu or Catholic or Jewish or Christian or Muslim, or whatever I may be, I may live in a family, live in a community, have parents or grandparents who are part of a religious faith tradition. Our house is Jewish. My grandparents were Jewish. When I think about learning to pray, I think about sitting next to my 4 grandparents in synagogue. That is religion. It was a gift of my grandparents, a gift of my parents. We kept Shabbat. Spirituality is not transmitted entirely through environment. Spirituality is our birthright. We are innately born as spiritual beings. Am I hard to hear?
The live stream doesn't have it, so maybe
Okay.
we should use it.
Hi.
Much better.
Yes, good. Spirituality is innate. How do we know this? Through the lens of science, we can use a twin study. We can look at any human capacity, temperament, risk for illness, height and weight, any human capacity, and determine the extent to which it is inborn or shaped by environment. I'll give you an example. I'm a parent of 3 children. The center child, who asked to go by center child, slept through the night at 18 months. So for 4 times a night for a year and a half, do you remember the little sound? Innocence. I'd get up, I'd walk across the house, and I'd soothe the baby. Her temperament was one of discomfort, and I could soothe her. By the time we're 30, our temperament is half innate, half environmentally formed. IQ is 60% innate, 40% environmentally formed. Although my colleague Dr. Kaufman can tell you with decades of life that changes. The capacity through which we experience spiritual life, what you just did, the innate seat of transcendent awareness through which we experience a relational spirituality is 1/3 innate. We are born with this capacity to be in dialogue with Spirit, our higher power, God, Hashem, Allah, whatever your word is. And just as we are born to be in relationship to the transcendent, who I call God, we are born to see God, the transcendent, in our love for one another. This is relational spirituality. So while scientists do not define spirituality all told, I will share with you the methods through which we've identified these threads of lived spirituality that are game-changing on the rest of our lives. There's one source by many names, and love of neighbor, that we might love one another in feeling the presence of this sacred divine source. Here's the roadmap. 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed. Now let's get back to the public square. There's certainly many young people here right now for whom there's a strong spiritual core, who are on a spiritual path. And still, there have never been so many in our country and in fellow post-industrial countries who do not. So I will share with you that I've spoken in the past few months in a number of our fellow countries. In Mexico, I'm going to Germany today. I've been on many beautiful, I love being on Indian podcasts. Love it, love it. Everybody's expressing the same concern. It doesn't matter where I am. That somehow, this country, we exported McDonald's, and we also exported radical materialism, which is to say the only thing that's real is the thing you can touch. And that was somehow confused in the 20th century with science. But science is a lens. It can be pointed at a broad host of questions, including the origin and impact of spirituality on the human life. And so science does not define spirituality, but we do explore the origin and impact of spirituality on the human life. Well, in our empty public square, the 2/3 embrace has never been so absent. And so we now face many young people who have never learned about morality as derived from ultimate source or ultimate reality. Morals are somehow cherry-picked or up for debate, right? Now, while certainly an examined life is a life worth living, examination used to include source, that we know the good. There is a truth to which we all have access and just engage. Never have so many people never meditated or prayed by the side of a grandparent or parent. And what this has meant is that the atrophy of the spiritual core, with the very sharp increase in the diseases of despair, has been a statistically related, equally sharp decrease in personal spiritual life and family faith observance. So if we can support the spiritual core, as all coming-of-age traditions hold, that with physical coming of age is a spiritual growth and augmented capacity and increased spiritual responsibility, bar and bat mitzvah, the anipi, the sweat lodge, confirmation, every tradition holds this. And strengthen the spiritual core. There is not hope as an aspiration. There is very well scientifically grounded hope as a series of facts that we can reverse the epidemic of despair. A young person, 19, 20, a standard deviation above as compared to below the mean, and a tendency to say, I turn to my higher power for guidance. When I have a tough decision to make, I ask God, Hashem, Allah, Spirit, what am I to do? And receive answers, like we just did in our practice. It is not a belief, it is a dynamic, transcendent relationship. He, she, is an 80% decreased relative risk of addiction. That was published in the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. 80% decreased risk of addiction. Using DSM criteria, drugs, alcohol, gaming addiction, the same addictive mechanism that attaches to drugs and alcohol attaches to behavioral addictions. So if you told me, okay, 70% protected against foolish risk, driving fast, jumping out the second-story window at a party, and in a study of studies, a meta-analysis through which all good studies are rounded up to yield 2,000 tragically completed suicides and 5,000 matched controls who did not take their life. There's a 62% decreased relative risk of completed suicide, the epidemic of our time, the epidemic by which young people are most likely to die. And that goes up to 82% when spiritual life is shared. Because like you are now at your tables, it's so beautiful to see. We see each other as souls on earth. We speak each other into full, lived spiritual existence, spiritual community. So as a mom, as a dad, as a parent, as a grandparent, if someone said, hey, there's this little blue pill, and you can give it to your teens, or when your kids go off to college, and they are fourth protected against the epidemic of their time. Any parent walk right into the Walgreens, right? I'd sleep on the wet pavement. I'd be right there in line for that little pill. And yet this is ours. This is who we are. Here is where we've just come and gone. This is 3,000 plus people to have experienced, to meet at this very moment of the study, criteria for PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And I invite you into thinking about the epidemic that is now passing, hopefully, but the past few years. Well, what we see here as you go out the x-axis are amongst all these people with trauma, more and more and more struggle. More sleeplessness, more intrusive memories, more anxiety, more despair, more difficult with connecting with other people. But as we go out the x-axis and see more and more trauma, up the y-axis are units of growth. More trauma, more growth. It's so important. I'm going to come down here. More trauma, more growth. More trauma, more growth. More trauma, more growth. Post-traumatic growth. Until we get so far out, we need support to grow. But we are built such that trauma is a gateway to an awakening of spiritual life, if we engage. Just as witness to miracles and the birth of a child, an unspeakably awesome sunset, sunlight on the water awakens our spiritual heart, so too can suffering. What God do you ask of me now? What spirit are you showing of me now? Whatever language is ours, what is being revealed here now? Through meditation, through prayer, through the transcendent dynamic with which we are endowed. So much is this the case that 75% of vets who suffered in war report meaningful growth at the same time that they meet criteria for PTSD. This is who we are. We are on a spiritual path. And on the other side, we are not simply brought back to recovery, but it is renewal. We are more than we are before. So where is the docking station of this awareness of which we speak, of which we just practiced? It is here. We published this in JAMA Psychiatry in 2014. These broad and pervasive regions in red are regions of cortical thickness, which, as you know, is processing power. And in particular, in people with a sustained spiritual life over 8 years, people for whom day in and day out, they see one another, they see the challenge, they see the opening as a walk on spiritual landscape, the go-to point of reference. Broad and pervasive regions of cortical thickness in the parietal, occipital, precuneus, which are regions of perception, reflection, and orientation. So I can be in the same family, and I can live on the same block, and I can go to the same job, and it all looks different through the red brain. This is our lens. With 80%, and in science this is very lovely, if another lab found it, so you're working as a field, another lab found not thickness, but thinness in these same regions in people with recurrent major depression. When we sent this in, as all my colleagues will share with you, in science, you send in an article, and two or three people read it blind to who you are, and then they send it back with notes for improvement, clarification, the peer review process. So by the time something's published, it has the good housekeeping seal of the scientific community. Our note back was, that's very interesting. Tell us now about what a red brain today means a year from now. And what we saw was the cortical thickness across these regions of awareness was associated a whole year from now with decreased levels of depression. Prospective evidence that sustained spiritual life may be neuroprotective against depression. Now, it's not that we don't suffer, because in this very same group, as these folks are about 38 now, 38, 40, you can see. Well, back when they were 26, so they've been followed for 40 years, we said, tell us about you. How important is your spiritual life to you? And back when they were 26, if they said, my spiritual life, whether within or without of a faith tradition, is highly important to me, standard deviation above the mean, they were 2.5 times more likely to have gotten there over the walk of the past 10 years, 16 to 26, through depression. Depression was the gateway for an awakening of their spiritual life. And when we looked at teens around the country, it appears that for many, many people, we know coming of age is a booting up of spiritual awareness. Through science, we chart that as a 50% increase in the heritable contribution in longitudinal twin studies, which means from the inside out comes a surge, an awakening. Bring a biological clock. Whether or not anyone told me, I hunger to know my ultimate purpose. Paul, you brought us here today. Our ultimate, not little p purpose, am I going to go into business or teaching or law, ultimate, big P purpose. And that is who I am on earth and who I am on earth in relation to existence itself. And with the existential hungerings of coming of age, the augmented capacity, the surge, can feel like a half-empty glass of spirituality. But it is different than most forms of depression. It appears to be a developmental depression, which is foundational to laying the most important variants that last the rest of our lives. So when your teen is depressed, of course assess how they got there. But it appears that 2/3 of the time when we've looked at large samples, and that mirrors what college counselors tell me, 2/3 of the time, we're not looking at a biologically driven depression. We're looking at coming of age, developmental depression. And this is the opportunity of the student's lifetime. What are you showing me now? We are raised exquisitely capably in our K-12 system to find out what we want and go for it. Goals, tactics, strategy. In the book with which I shared with you, that is called Our Achieving Awareness. But achieving awareness, as we just saw in our COVID era, what do I want? How am I going to get it? I've got to get it. I've got to get that job. I've got to get into that school. I've got to get that promotion. I've got to get him to marry me. I've got to. It actually runs a system, the insulin striatum, which my collaborators at Yale Medical School call the addiction network. We have in our air and water, absent spirituality in the public square, a culture that teaches addiction. I've got to have it, the insulin striatum run. Well, we've invited that very same young person to tell us another story. Tell us about a time where instead of got to get that promotion, got to get into UCLA Medical School, got to get her to marry me, there was another story where you felt in deep connection with your higher power, spirit, the universe, God, like we just did in the third chair. And the story changes. And it goes like this. I'm walking down the street. I'm feeling like such a loser. I was just turned down at 7 out of 9 medical schools. I'm never going to be a doctor like my mother and father. But then I see light in the leaves. And I know God has a plan for me, and I will be a healer in the way I am intended. Or we were going to get married. He gave me a promise ring. We went out 3 years in college, and then graduation week, he called it off. I felt so ugly. I felt like such a loser. But then, sitting in the childhood pews by my parents and grandparents, I felt this great love. I felt their love. I felt God's love, and I knew, yes, I'll love again. The profound rearrangement of meaning is not running through achieving awareness. It's running through our awakened awareness, an awakening of our natural spiritual capacity to see into the transcendent nature of life. And then goodbye insulin striatum, and what runs in the fMRI is the bonding network. We know that we are loved and held. A shift in the intention network from top down dorsal to bottom up ventral. And many people say, instead of I gotta have it, I never knew. Wow, this whole new yellow door over here. Guided from dorsal to ventral. loved and held guided, and finally the parietal that puts in and out our boundaries so that, as we say at SMBI, we are a point and we are a wave. We are magnificently, beautifully diverse in our bio-bodysuit and GPS coordinates, and yet we are also white caps on one ocean, part of one wave of spirit or consciousness. God is the superposition of everybody and more. Loved, held, guided, and never alone. When we realize this capacity to be in a deeper relationship with life, life unfolds entirely differently. This is life when we awaken our awareness, when we use our awakened brain. Now, in recap, that's your gift. I'm not asking you to buy it. Here we are, right? Innately spiritual beings. 1/3 innate, 2/3 environmentally formed. No one matters more than a grandparent. Grandparents ask me all the time, I only see them once a month. That'll do it. That will do it. But what about the upside? What about knowing who we are, thriving? What about the character strengths and virtues that are so well known? Grit, optimism. What about forgiveness, the relational values? So let me invite you to think of a young person who you've known who is full of grit. And now someone with commitment. And now someone with optimism. You've met many wonderful people. How many at the moment were you thinking of? Why is that? Because the character strengths and virtues sort in the same people. Meaning grit, optimism, gratitude, forgiveness. 5,000 plus college students. If I'm high in meaning, lucky blue group, the blue group, I'm high in grit. I'm high in optimism. I'm high in gratitude. The blue folks are high in everything, such that the character strengths and virtues might best be seen as a singular entity, character, virtue. We have character, we have virtue. And in our classroom, in our home, we love equally the red folks who struggle because they're low in grit and low in optimism. These character strengths are virtues unto their own, and they supply us with traction to go after our goals, outward success, whatever that might be for us. Well, for 85% of college students in this 5,500 person sample, and when we look longitudinally, it was replicated, we have as much character, grit, optimism, as we have daily spiritual awareness. 85% of young people have as much character. They stick with things, they're good to other people. If you hire them, they don't steal from you, they come to work, they're nice to their teammates, as they have a strong spiritual core. Right? And so I'll share with you that while the Army has for decades has a positive psychology intervention, they now for the past 2 years, the U.S. Army is putting in a spiritual readiness initiative so that every young soldier or his or her way can have a strong spiritual core. The character strengths are the beautiful, bright pink and purple rhododendrons. Spiritual awareness are the roots. Why? Well, here's the hard work of growing up. Who am I? Who are you? And what's the nature of life? Well, who am I from the center of a public square? I am the one who's in the top 5% of my entire class. I took AP Chemistry, I took AP Calculus, and I am going to a top 20 college. Actually, I'm the one who's in the bottom third of my class, and I've worked really hard and it just doesn't come together. Who am I? I am number one. I am captain of the fencing team, and I'm also captain of the squash team. I am a tremendously good athlete. Actually, I was cut as a junior from JV. I am my outward parts and pieces. A public square absent a spiritual core is a transactional space. And far too often our relationships, even here in the hallowed halls of academia, can become transactional. But what the Army has done is ask every single commander to become not just transactional in training his or her soldiers, but transformational. Who are we really to one another as souls on earth? Walking each other through this work. Well, who am I? Let's play it both ways. If I'm oh so smart, you know what, I just got into Caltech and I'm going off to Caltech. And I get there, and I know I'm pretty smart, but suddenly I'm in the bottom third. who am I? Or I'm a huge champion. I am really strong. I'm the best on the soccer team, and I just made the national team. And I went out there and I played well, but I didn't play well enough, and we just lost to Brazil. I am my performance, and when I don't perform, it is devastating. So I will share with you that performance-driven suicides have accounted for clusters of youth taking their lives outside of Palo Alto High School, in the Rye, New York community, Columbia University, of 9 publicly acknowledged suicides in 1 year. Palo Alto now has along the train track where the kids threw themselves a fence and a full-time guard, because if you can delay someone for 5 minutes from taking his or her life, they won't. On another day, they're very glad to be alive. 85% of people who attempt suicide and survive, 85% on another day are really glad they're alive. So let's tell it another way. Who am I? I am with a spiritual core because of how you look at me, because of how you've mentored me, because of how you've taught me my nature through meditation and values and prayer and community. I'm a soul on earth. I'm a child of God. I'm a being of infinite worth. And it was really disappointing today that I lost for my team in the championship, our soccer tournament to Brazil. It was really disappointing. It was a rough, rough day. But it's not who I am. It is noise on the larger purpose and calling of my path. Because being oh so strong or oh so smart, those are endowments, gifts, through which I might carve my purpose, my contribution, my calling, my applied spiritual path. A far more resilient stance, enough to put me up on the blue line as a teenager or a young adult. If I'm a soul on earth, you're a soul on earth. And our relationship is about interest, it's about commitment, it's about love. On a tough day, it becomes about forgiveness. But you are much more than the 96 when I got the 82. Our lives are much more about narrow competition. In our Awakened Awareness groups here at Columbia and Barnard, we welcome undergraduates who come and love awakening to each other as souls on earth, who love awakening to each other, speaking to each other's higher self. It's simply a choice of shifting the conversation, moving our awareness, shifting into transcendent awareness. And we need both. At the table of human knowing, we need the head, logic, empiricism. We need the heart, intuition, mystical awareness. We need the skeptic to keep a voice, but not the bouncer at the door. And at that table of human knowing, when we combine our many faculties, we have a highly interconnected brain. A highly interconnected brain that is more innovative, more creative, both at work and in our lives. So here's life with and without a spiritual core. We have Awakened Campus Global coming up in November. And India is at the table, as is Europe, as is North and South America, following Awakened Campus in the US last April. College students and all who love and care for them are eager to apply this roadmap of science to coming of age. We sent out an invitation. We had 500 university leaders show up for Awakened Campus US. Provosts, deans, heads of counseling. And now we have people from all our beautiful global community showing up. This is who we are. This is how we're built. I'll leave you with one last thought. The practice we shared was not one generated by the hermetic human, the tightly sealed wrapped human, in which the brain, like a machine, generates thoughts. But rather is a view of who we are as being in dialogue or receiving sacred consciousness. It is an open system. Well, I'll share with you that those very red-brained folks who deepened their spiritual awareness through the path of suffering and developed a strong, spiritually awake brain. They also used their brain in a very compelling way. They gave off the back of their head, posterior high amplitude alpha. High amplitude alpha is also given off if we start feeling better with Prozac, SSRIs. But if you take the SSRI away, no more alpha. Coming of age through developmental depression establishes a deep connection at the level I would say of consciousness, certainly we pick it up as a wavelength. Remember, we're an open system, so alpha goes by another name. It's Schumann's resonance, the wavelength from the Earth's crust up 1 mile all the way around the Earth. The spiritually engaged brain vibrates with the resonance of all life, of nature, of creation. We return to our nature, we return to our source. And I can only hope that someday my grandkids will laugh and say, Grandma was so old-fashioned, she measured sacred consciousness by its wavelength. This is yours, your science, given to you with love and your own leadership. Much blessing. We're going to do Q&A.
Yeah, we're going to do the Q&A. Wow, does anybody else feel like hit with the wave of knowledge? It's just me. I feel like I'm processing so much. Yes, you have a question? Oh, incredible. Okay, well, we have tons of eager people ready to ask Dr. Lisa Miller some questions. So the way this is going to work is you raise your hand. We'll walk over, hand you the mic so that the people on our live stream can hear you as well. And we'll take it from there.
Yes.
Thank you. That was an awesome talk. I am not a skeptic, not at all, but I'm going to ask a question which may make me sound like I'm a skeptic. So in the initial part of your talk, you said there was a Pentagon study with 18 to 25-year-olds, if I understood correctly, and the fact that they were in, anxiety, despair, not connected spiritually. I'm just wondering that if your controls also included something with respect to time, like let's say if we were to take the, a cohort of 500 people, or 5,500, whatever number you had, from say after World War II, we don't have that information, I don't think, would you be able to say that this is really an epidemic now as compared to what it was under very similar circumstances?
Great, thank you. So the question, as I hear it, is the difference between, is this a developmental effect? We've all passed through a phase of life. Or is this a cohort effect? There's something about youth culture today. And I would say that the part that is timeless is developmental depression, that there is inherently a surge of spiritual awakening with late adolescence, emerging adulthood, and that often brings developmental depression. But if we look at the rates by big polls like Pew and Gallup, the rate at which someone says, yes, my personal spirituality is highly important to me, is less than it used to be, and there's far fewer people ascribing to faith traditions. So, in a faith tradition comes packaged a practice of transcendence, a language to call it something, a community to show you how it plays out across our lives, ceremonies, traditions. A lot comes in a faith tradition. And while it may be the case that for some people they're on a journey to find where the slipper fits, the right faith home for them, it simply is the case in the data that it is spirituality with or without religion that's protective, but in making a spiritual adult, there's a tremendous benefit of a faith tradition passed through the generations. And it doesn't matter which one it is. But when the torch is passed from grandparent to parent to child, it is even more protective against the diseases of despair than if it's in one generation or if the child finds it on their own. So there's something about the air and water, the guidance of daily life, who we are, how we look at each other at the table, profoundly informed by a faith tradition. Again, there are people who are spiritual but not religious. They derive great benefit, but here's the study. I have a very treasured colleague, Dr. Sue Luther. She was once my TA when I was in college, and I always looked up to her. And she went out and she did a study for 10 years looking at children in under-resourced communities and found addiction and depression and suicide and anxiety. And after 10 years, Dr. Luther said, I need a control group. I'm going to go to these highly resourced communities outside San Francisco, outside New York. And to her amazement and that of the field, Dr. Luther found higher rates of anxiety, addiction, depression in highly resourced high schools than in the inner city. And she wanted to know why. And so, being very clever, she went back and looked under the hood. She rounded up students at these highly resourced large high schools and said, tell me, who's really popular here? And everyone knew who was popular. Well, that group of girls, they're very popular, and that guy over there, he's super popular. And then Dr. Luther came back a week later, rounded up new students and said, tell me about this group of girls or that fellow over there. And in this way, determined the truly lived behavioral correlates of social esteem of the tidal wave, the air and water, the culture. So what might you imagine was the #1 predictor in girls of popularity? SMBI knows the answer, so. It was weight. Yes?
I had a question on,
Oh, I'm just going to finish this point and look, thank you. The #1 predictor was weight. Parts and pieces, transactional. And the #2 predictor was interpersonal cruelty to instantiate rank, like Mean Girls. That's the tidal wave. Beautiful souls on earth raised in a tidal wave. And boys, #1 predictor of popularity.
Athletic ability.
Thank you. It was in the mix, and people, and yes, it's in the mix. The #1 predictor was substance use. Popular boys, as endorsed by their entire school, use drugs. And the #2 was not intimacy, but exploitation, racking up people on your, notches on the belt. Again, beautiful souls in the tidal wave. So I teamed up with Dr. Luther. I said, okay, we know that spirituality is completely game-changing in our lives. Let's look in these communities. And what might you imagine? Across the United States, 70% of young people say spirituality is important to me. 70%. So in these highly resourced, excellent high schools, they're all on the lists. What might be the rate of personal spiritual life? It was down. 15%, less than a quarter of the national rate of high school students in top highly resourced high schools, less than a quarter of the national rate. Those 15% were indeed protected against the otherwise elevated rates of addiction, depression, and anxiety. So any parent would say, certainly I wanted to know, how do I get my 3 kids in that 15%? Without exception, their families, their parents, their grandparents were part of faith communities or communities of great consistent contribution, like Doctors Without Borders, Habitat for Humanity. What happened? There was somewhere else, other than the school locker, where they were looked at as a soul on earth, a child of God, a being of infinite worth. And so it didn't matter if my dad just made $10 million and was on the paper, it was on the paper for going to jail. Because I show up and I'm looked at as a soul on earth, as walking a journey. And life was entirely different because of that. So that's where the Roadmap of Science can change the culture and climate of any school, and we've worked on that and found a way to do it. You're all welcome to Awaken Schools, any organization, any family. And this you probably already knew, but now you can look at all that you did well and smile in the reflection of science. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. Hi.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. That was very enlightening.
Thank you.
Well, I speak from the experience of social work, both here in the US and in India.
Yes.
And you addressed a large portion of my question right toward the end regarding resources to communities. But consistently, in India and in the US, why are spiritual discourses, resources not as prevalent in economically challenged communities in contrast to, economically and class privileged communities? Like if I should say, I go to Silverman College's social work on the other side of Harlem. We see a lot of these conferences happen on this side of Harlem in contrast to that. And what effect at large is that having, the access to resources, to spiritual resources? What is the effect at large because of that?
Thank you. Thank you. I have good news. In the U.S., in D.C., Department of Health and Human Services has an office, a center, for faith-based and community initiatives. And this is an office led by the Reverend Dr. Q. English. She spoke at Awaken Campus, and she is now in collaboration with us at Columbia, the Spirituality and Mind-Body Institute. And what we're doing is figuring out a way where deeply committed lay members of the faith community, someone who you just know will always be there, someone who leads the initiatives. They could be an elder, they could be someone who is particularly caring for the children in the faith community. There will be a way in which the lay leaders can be certified so that it goes into the official policy bank and receive resources. And we're piloting that now, so that lay leaders might be certified in the creation of faith-based community partnerships in all of the ways in which foundationally spiritual support can be brought to the specific pain points in that community. So in a very, I think, overall well-intentioned, vast mental health system, there's tremendous amounts of specific needs that are unseen and unmet. But the faith community sees them and wants to help, and is. And this is a way of getting government dollars respectfully into the hands of those who are actually doing the work, and further equipping them to make more partnerships and have science and more tools, more models. So if you're interested, please reach out, because this is happening now. We have 2 more years to get it done. Good. Yes, yes. My colleague, my beautiful colleague.
Okay, that's wonderful talk. Your work is so important in the field of psychology, and it's wonderful to see you in a clinical psychology program. But there's such a dearth of training about the protective factors that spirituality can provide in most clinical psychology programs around the world. Are you familiar with any really well-done randomized control trials that have looked at other forms of psychotherapy like CBT and psychoanalytic therapy, and have attempted to create a new form of psychotherapy that directly incorporates these spiritual principles and kind of compare them all to each other in a systematic way? I was just curious.
That's a great question. So there have been a series of small and medium-sized clinical trials where CBT is tested against CBT that is religiously informed by a specific faith tradition, or in some cases, interpersonal psychotherapy, IPT spiritually informed. And as you might imagine, where spirituality is present, there is growth in spiritual awareness. And it's very interesting. There is added decrease of symptoms, but they do get better in both conditions. So they get a little more better, and they have spiritual growth. But, you know, you really want to know what I think about randomized trials? I think the consciousness is in and through everybody in the trial. And so we spent all this money. I had a mentor who got a grant for $5 million to test CBT against some form of showing up social support group. And he couldn't believe that after all the data on how helpful CBT is, they came out the same. But it seemed to me, you know, if you think of superposition or consciousness in us, through us, or when we're bonded, that there's no place but in a single lab and a single department doing a so-called 2-condition clinical trial, the consciousness is washing in and out, and I didn't have the heart to tell him because he was so crestfallen. But that's what I think. So we do open trials, lots of them. Thank you. Yes.
Dr. Miller,
Hello. Yes.
Hello, I'm very impressed with your presentation. So I have one question. You touched upon K through 12. We have several teachers who we work with in the bottom 35 percentile of socioeconomic, in US, like Florida and South Carolina and North Carolina. And those teachers need specific help in classroom management. How would you help me help them?
Beautiful, thank you. We, and you are most welcome to join, have an Awakened School Institute. We went around for 3 years My first book was called The Spiritual Child, and the first thing I found was that when you step in a lobby of a school, you know if it's a spiritually supportive school. And it was true whether it was under-resourced or highly resourced, whether it was religious or non-religious. When you walked in the door, you knew if you were in a spiritual school. And I said, well, how magnificent these fortunate children get this support. Let's understand it. Can we pan for gold and somehow come up with the DNA of a spiritually supportive school? And so we spent 3 years, and we went to West Philly, to a school founded by the Black Panthers, into Oakland. We went to several highly resourced independent schools. We went to religious schools. We went everywhere. And what we found was that it was not what landed on the desk. It was not the curriculum that created a spiritually supportive school, although 90+% of efforts have landed on the desk. It was an intentional, relational culture and climate. Who are we to one another? Almost like a faith community, whether or not it was a religious school. Who are we? Seeing each other into existence, listening and having visions of the students beyond what they know of themselves. So we distilled 12 drivers that can be implemented in any school. For instance, as we just did, a receptive practice of transcendence. Mindfulness is wonderful to quiet our minds so that we might then cross into spiritual awareness. A language, as comes packaged in religion, of transcendent reality and spiritual values. A point person whose full-time job it is to stand up in front of the school at a faculty meeting and say, I see that we want to throw this student out, but what do our spiritual values really say about who we are to him on his path? Those are 3 examples. A relationship to nature that's one of deep learning and connection, not just beauty. Although beauty's great. So these 12 drivers can be implemented, and they're independent of resources. They have nothing to do, right? So,
But what about then the separation of church and state comes
Yes.
into play?
yes, so a foundational notion that spirituality is an innate human capacity and independent of whatever religion someone may be given or not given, went through the Pentagon's legal office of JAG and was ratified. So all over the US Army, which is very publicly funded, there is spiritual support. The Spiritual Readiness Initiative is there to support the soldier physically, mentally, and spiritually, in whatever tradition, pluralism, or outside of any tradition. The 12 drivers of spiritually supportive culture can be applied to any school, any business, any organization. Of course, teachers gave this decades. We harnessed master teacher experience, and they very generously gave this forward for free, and we give Awaken Schools for free. So it is 8 sessions online, and then we come to your school. And we'd be more than happy to talk about partnering. We've been asked to come to the Aspen Valley and do a whole cluster of schools to shift the conversation about what education can be. Thank you for asking. Awaken Schools, it's online at Teachers College.
Thank you.
Yeah, another question.
Hi.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, for your insightful talk and the research that you continue to do in this area. I was just wondering, would you want to kind of make a difference between white spirituality and black spirituality? I mean, would you want to say that particularly Euro-American centric spirituality would be different from black spirituality, or spirituality from the subalterns? People, I mean, I'm from India, so there are a lot of indigenous people in India, tribals. So, like, I mean, you have talked about relational spirituality, of course, but I mean, it's the difference between saying all lives matter and black lives matter. These 2 things are different. So would you want to make a difference between these 2 types of spirituality, or would you want to say that it's probably all the same because it comes from the same source? So just want some reactions to that.
Thank you. So there are magnificent, beautiful wisdom traditions, faith traditions, religious traditions all around the world. There is, and there is one spiritual brain, and we all have it. So the first thing we know is that religious war is obsolete. There is one spiritual brain, and we all have it. Of course, there's human variance. You might compose music and I can just dance. You might do advanced programming and I can run my computer. But there, we all have, just as we have an innate language capacity, we come hardwired with the capacity for spiritual connection and awareness. People have looked at two pieces of evidence to your very interesting, important question. We looked around the world and we figured if 1/3 of our innate spiritual capacity is innate by the time we're 30, clearly then around the world there must be some common phenotypes, some lived human experience that's common. And so we looked in India, China, and the US and found through that constellation the 5 most highly represented faith traditions on earth. And what we saw was whether it were in India, China, or the US, the same 5 phenotypes structurally emerged. Everyone in India, everyone in the US, everyone in China perceives, again, along a bell curve of individual difference, that we are interconnected, one. The parietal. We are magnificently unique. We're in different GPS coordinates, but we are one. Profound. What happens here has everything to do with what happens 2,000 miles away. Everyone perceives that. And again, with individual variance. But every country showed that. Love, second phenotype, is a mutative force. It's not just an emotion, like happiness. Love is a transformative force. Love in your heart is changing something this second somewhere. Oneness, love, of transcendent awareness. That was your table. Ask them if they love you. They were there. An on-ramp, a meditation, prayer, a practice of transcendence. An off-ramp, morality derived from this deep transcendent awareness of love and oneness. Unitive love. Morality derived from that. You are my sister, you are my brother. In the Army, the spiritual core is built to get way upstream of the otherwise downstream harmful behaviors, which are very harmful behaviors in every institution has. Okay? Relational ethics, because you are my brother, you're my sister, I wouldn't dream of harming you. So those are the 4, the on-ramp, the off-ramp of unitive awareness. And the 5th is of all the phenotypes, the one that most highly correlates to broad and pervasive regions of the red brain, a strength of spiritual awareness, awakened awareness. Any guesses?
Gratitude.
Close. Altruism, love of neighbor, prayer and action. When we help people, as you're all doing. Service. When we feel the presence of Spirit, God, our highest power, in and through our love for one another, and do something about it. And if I'm stuck and I can't feel anything, just push me out the door, and the act of service can help reawaken the fullness of spirituality. It's the most powerful of the 5 phenotypes. That is common, and 2/3 environmentally formed means it is experienced and nuanced and contoured by a rich range of faith and wisdom traditions, symbol and language and practice. Of course, different practices weigh in on spiritual awareness differently. Andy Newberg has done some nice work on that if you want to follow up the difference between one kind of meditation and another. But the deep component of transcendent awareness is universal, and it's all of ours. Yes?
We're going to take the Q&A until 11:10 about, so that gives us time for about 2 to 3 more questions.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for your lecture. I believe you. And love what you said. Now, how do we implement it? What is the greatest barrier to walking up, not as a collective consciousness group with one of the large organizations that's probably taking what I imagine the sector, if you group people into different sectors, the ones who are on the verge of suicide and the ones who are already, thank you, or I was thanking her, and the ones who are either on the verge of suicide and then the ones who are already at the top there. But then you have that whole other group, and you have all of us walking out, and I'm sure we'll all encounter in the next week somebody within that range of going through the adolescent depression that we'd like to say, hey, why don't you get more spiritual today? I mean, how does one open that conversation? What are the greatest barriers? Just to open it, I'm not asking for all the steps to get them enlightened, but just to start the conversation.
Thank you, that's so important. And as you framed deep implicit in your question, it is in fact very often through a relational connection that we can reawaken, right, very often. So I would say that it's a conversation piece for all of us to share. I can say through the lens of science in the awakening and reawakening of the spiritual teen or young person. Very often it is walking the walk and talking the walk. So in an unconditionally loving relationship, walking the walk, doing and acting spiritual values, right? And then explaining what we're doing. I feel God's presence in everyone here. Everyone here could have been my sister or brother in our house. It's all how God arranged it. The running an open, clear voice so that this is the light. That's the torch. We don't make it, we carry it. And we're letting a young person walk by our side and hold it with us. I can share with you that many young people are hungry. They're so hungry. And they will be fascinated if you are transparent onto your own spiritual path, a time when you felt cut off or lost, when you, if you did, where you may have gone through developmental depression. When we speak openly in the first person about spiritual life, they are riveted, they are hardwired, hungry to know. I'll share with you an example. I had a very spiritually expressive mother, and also a very religious mother. And she would light the Shabbat candles and she'd cry and she'd say, thank you, God, for the children. And we thank God for everything in the meal and for the sunset. And my father lovingly sat there like this, lovingly present. He's a professor, he's quiet, he's on the back porch reading plays. But when his own mother passed, very, very years ago, I woke up, as I always did. I was 9 years old. It was 4 in the morning when I always woke up. I went down to our living room, and for the first time, I saw my father sitting on the ground. And he chose to tell me what he was feeling. He said, I had a dream last night, and Grandma Ellie, she just passed, was by my side. We were walking down Grand Avenue in Des Moines, Iowa, where he'd grown up. I said, you know, Grandma Ellie loved to dress up in fashionable clothes with beautiful jewelry, but she, in our dream, was in a very everyday, plain gray suit. And there she was, walking by my side, where we'd walked so many times. And I realized she was saying, I am your mother, I will still be your mother. I will walk by your side. So I'm 56, he said that when I was 9, and it moves me to my core. It is also the evidence, despite several empirical articles that our team has published, as how I know and can perceive that our ancestors walk with us. So when we are open, we form a bond that is far more powerful. He never asked if I got an A or a B. He never wanted to know if I won the race, but he shared that. And that's who my father is. So that's where we go. And that is the deepest form of spiritual support and awakening when we share of our own path.
Yes.
Our eminent.
I didn't mean to stop you.
Thank you for that magnificent presentation, Dr. Miller. I was just thinking while listening to you that she's going to put me out of my job.
It's a circle onto one line.
Scientists are going to replace swamis and theologians and all.
All hands on deck.
But my question relates with that. It's a difficult question, something that I've been wrestling with, and let me see if I can put it in some words. The simplest way I can put it is, I would like the claims, the metaphysical claims of religion and spirituality to be true. And unfortunately, what you have been saying till now, all of it works. It's really good for humanity. It's good for young people. It's good for everybody. It's really wholesome. It helps us it sustains, life-sustaining. But at the background where you're coming from is science and this whole academia. It's science. And the scientific worldview would have it that, no, you're just imagining the whole thing. It may work. It may even be good for you. It may be life-sustaining. But really, there's no evidence for God or heaven or one consciousness or even transcendence. if you were to talk with Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens or somebody, I'm not recommending that, but if you were, they might say that it works, and your evidence shows that. But the metaphysics behind religion and spirituality, science would strongly oppose that. And I would want that to be true. I would want it to be true that I really do exist in some form after death, and science would say you really don't. I would really want it to be true that I am one with the universe, and science would say that you feel you're one with the universe, but you aren't.
Okay, so skip to the last third of the awakened brain. The first 2/3 is how it does change our lives. The last third is there's a new wave of science.
So exactly. So I was thinking, right now you talked about your dad, the worldview that he came with, which made him to be, like sort of genial when he listened to your mother, but also a little stepping back, being more careful about what he'll accept and will not accept. So how do you respond to that? Do the ontology, the metaphysics of spirituality, all traditions and modern science, are they coming together?
I'm so grateful you asked. It's such an exciting time for exactly the reason you raised, that science now is starting to look at some of the ontological wisdom of our traditions. I'll give you 2 quick studies. One, it's the last third of the awakening brain has these references in it. Akhter Hof, a scientist in Hawaii, invited a traditional healer into the MRI. And way over here, down the hall, and then in another building in some case, was a second MRI with the patient. The traditional healer starts to do his or her work, and the predictable pattern comes up time and time again in the MRI. Within an instant, the same pattern is seen in the patient way down the hall or even in another building. One state of consciousness detected, reflected, tracked by our brain, pumping blood, and followed by those MRIs. So it's one of the studies that's starting to show non-locality of consciousness or superposition of consciousness. That type of study is happening more and more, and founded here at Columbia is the Academy of Post-Material Science, who will be giving some seminars at Awaken Campus on November 29th and 30th online, Awaken Campus. So there's this beautiful science, and I think it's never been the limitation so much of science, because science is a perfectly good lens. The limitation has been in the scientists to be inspired to see the question and then roll out science in its usual method to address a ontological question. And increasingly that is being done. And I'm so grateful you raised that, because the new Oxford University Handbook of Spirituality and Psychology will be coming out in about 6 months, and it is predicated on an open system of human consciousness. So you get one for free, because you already saw the problem.
We are going to take our last question and then wrap it up. Hi, Dr. Miller. I'm over here.
Hi, yes.
Hi, it's Isabella. I'm a student at SMBI. So the wellness industry in the United States is a tens of billions of dollar industry. If we were to look at the roots of the wellness industry in the United States, it is filled with capitalism, white supremacy, racism, sexism, and ableism. The spiritual performance of what I've experienced as a white, able-bodied woman in spirituality, researching and continuing to be curious. The performative nature of spirituality and wellness is something that I feel really conflicted with, because we see so much inaction towards equanimity and racial justice, and maybe I'll have a question, but ultimately it's seeking some reflection on the hypocrisy
that is really rife in spirituality culture, and the whiteness that is dominating it. And so, especially for young people looking to create a spiritual life, there's a lot of avenues in which folks can get involved into pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, not believing in science, not believing in things like, with the government. I tangenting a little bit. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. What can we do about this?
Thank you. So this challenge is old as the hills. And we have within us a compass that knows what's true. If we look at people, even in the most, I'll give you an example. We looked at children of opiate addicts. And what percentage of opiate addicts would you say spiritual life is important to me? Actively struggling, in pain with opiate addiction. 4%. 96% of people struggle terribly. 4%. But we looked at their children. And the children were not at 70%, but they were at 40%. They were about half the national rate versus 4%. The naturally spiritual child still had a strong sense of spirituality, a spiritual core. And then we looked at them, they were 11, and their parents were addicts, and we said, okay, the intergenerational transmission of addiction is a very well documented fact in science. How's the child doing? Well, the child, whenever available, had turned to the adult in their life with the most healthy, aligned form of spirituality and become concordant. So we are not a blank slate. We have a compass, if you will. And there's selective spiritual seeking socialization. They can be concordant and walk with the torch from the healthiest adult in their life. And if they did, they were 90% protected against the otherwise almost fait accompli of addiction, as measured by not picking up alcohol and cigarettes. So my point in that study is when everything was very tough around the child, she or he found the teacher, the mentor, with the healthiest form of spirituality and became concordant with that person. There wasn't one case in our sample where they became concordant and had a increased risk. In every case, they developed a protective benefit. So we're knowers. And I think the challenge you describe of an authentic message, well, we're equipped to know in the resonance of our heart what's true. I think we come with what we need. And I think we always have. Thank you.